Helen Bonfils led at a time where women really didn't have an opportunity to be front and center in decision making.
I think she was one of the few women who owned a major newspaper.
I find that a very interesting dynamic in how then she would transfer into the arts.
And she started an arts and culture revolution here in Denver.
Her vision perhaps changed the culture of Denver for generations and generations to come.
As strong and enduring as the Rocky Mountains they stood beside, as visionary as the views of the Grand Plains they looked across, the women inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame are trailblazers whose work has improved and enriched our lives. They are teachers, scientists, ranchers, leaders in business, education, religion, and the arts. Women who have been recognized for their many contributions to our state, our country, and the world. I'm Renelda Muse, and these are the stories of great Colorado women.
Helen was born a princess into a family with a lot of resources.
She was a very charitable person, and her wealth helped many organizations.
Helen's greatest legacy is certainly her ability to use her financial resources for the public good.
What's unusual is that she single-mindedly determined that she wanted to bring a culture and class to this community that others believed might not be possible.
So a true patron of the arts.
From early on in her life, Helen was always interested in pursuing a career in the theater.
Helen grew up in the Bonfils mansion at 10th and Humboldt Street, which had 51 rooms, including a little theater in it, which she got very much interested in, and she would make sets out of cardboard boxes, use her dolls, give them names, and put on little productions there.
Helen always enjoyed and appreciated the theater, but her father was not supportive of her pursuing a career that way.
It's a very interesting relationship that she had apparently with her father, that she was the daughter of this very big figure in the Denver community, and he was a tough guy. He was a really strict father. So I find that a very interesting dynamic in how then she would flower in the arts as she did.
Helen Bonfils and her sister May were born in Peaksville, New York. Helen's birthday was commonly acknowledged as November 26, 1889, and they spent the first few years of their life in New York and then moved on to Kansas City, where her father was involved in the lottery, and eventually moved to Denver, Colorado when she was about 6 to enjoy a life as a media mogul.
On August 1st, 1892, Fred Bonfils and his partner Harry Tamman started the Denver Post and quickly built it into a very famous newspaper in not only Colorado but in the nation.
Neither Bonfils or Tamman had any experience with journalism, so they were very creative, to say the least, about running this newspaper. And they turned it into one of the most sensational and successful newspapers ever. By 1901, they'd surpassed the old-timer here at the Rocky Mountain News.
And as Miss Helen grew up, her father had her working at the paper, mostly doing accounting work and that type of thing. But she also developed some understanding of the operation of the paper. And during the 1920s and early 30s, she had administrative duties at the Post.
In 1932, Fred passed away and left the newspaper to Helen and at least one other member of her family.
Her sister was 6 years older than Helen. Her sister eloped when the sister was age 21, much against her father's wishes. And as a result, her father sort of kept Sister May off at one side all the time, and it was very clear that Helen was the preferred heir and that May was going to be excluded. And as a result, May began a lot of litigation to contest her father's will. It all ended up that Helen still had main control, but it created a situation that meant the sisters were going to remain apart, and they never really spoke to one another or got close to one another at all.
Miss Helen was tossed into being a businesswoman at an early age.
It's amazing what Helen did as a woman at the Denver Post. I think she was one of the few women who owned a major newspaper.
When I bought the Denver Post in 1987, everybody in the building, in a worshipful fashion, referred to her as Miss Helen.
The origin of that name came when she was growing up. They had a cook, a gardener. Miss Helen had her own personal nanny, I guess you would call her, that helped her as she grew up. And from a young girl's point, she was called Miss Helen. She liked to be called Miss Helen. And when her father had her become active in the Post, everyone referred to her as Miss Helen.
Running a newspaper is hard, and dealing with the public is hard. Women weren't looked upon as equals to men in those days. They were there to support their husbands and to support their fathers, but they weren't business people.
She led at a time where women really didn't have an opportunity to be front and center in decision making and policy setting and having a profound impact on the direction that a city or a state were going to go.
They must have felt somewhat lonely because there might not have been another strong businesswoman in Colorado at the time she took control.
She took the bull by the horns, as it is, and she made sure that she was leading where she knew she could have a profound impact.
Miss Helen knew how important her father believed this newspaper was to the Rocky Mountain West, and she knew that it was her job to make sure that it kept that position in the West. And while she didn't know how to run a newspaper, she knew how to find people who did.
She also brought in Palmer Hoyt, a very respectable editor from Oregon, who cleaned up the Post with some of its biases, some of the facts that it ran its editorials in the news columns, didn't have a separate editorial page till Hoyt comes along, and he makes it a much better respected, more highly regarded newspaper. She also greatly improved the physical plant. Instead of the old Champa Street building, built a brand new building on California Street, which took a lot of money and a lot of daring to put this money in to invest in a newspaper. Also brought new presses, new equipment, hired many more reporters, paid them better, greatly advanced the professionalism of the Denver Post. And from then on, their circulation just boomed. They did indeed become the voice of the Rocky Mountain Empire, as the Post liked to brag.
She had two really remarkable contributions to the experience in the Denver Post building. The first was every day she had 24 yellow roses delivered, not only so she could enjoy their beauty, but so everyone around her could as well. And just speaking a little bit to her heart, she was very philanthropic. In fact, the doors of the Denver Post were always open to the community. If someone was having a hard time financially or otherwise, she'd meet them in the lobby, she'd write out a check, and she'd never ask for a repayment. She just really believed that a hand up was better than a handout.
She was a very big personality.
She would call people honey. She was friendly, open to people. Was interested in all walks of life. I heard from Monsignor John Anderson, who was her great friend and confessional companion, is how they would travel around together in her Fleetwood Cadillac with the chauffeur Tiger and her priest.
She just made you feel like you were her only friend, or she was your best friend.
She was funny, that she had a real comic flair.
Oh yes, Helen was quite flamboyant. She wore high heels. She dressed flashily, somewhat above the level of most Denverites. May called her a show-off. Others objected to this kind of flashy dress, the hair that never turned from blonde to white.
She was such a strong personality. They say that her personality is still inciting reactions at the Elitch Theater to this day. Well, she started working at the Elitch Theater in 1934. She met her future husband, George Soames, there, who was a director. She auditioned as an actress at the Elitch Theater under her mother's maiden name of Barton. so that she wouldn't fail as Helen Bonfils. And lo and behold, she got the job. But when she showed up to rehearsals, they were calling her by her mother's maiden name, and she said, no, I'm Helen Bonfils. I just didn't want to fail as a Bonfils.
She was relentless in her pursuit of her dream.
And she became part of that acting company and acted in small parts or walk-on parts for a few years.
Some of Helen's first professional appearances were at Elitch's theater, where she was more or less a regular and also a favorite of George Sums, the director there.
And George was a very urbane, very sharp guy. And Helen and he worked together on various things at Elitch's.
In fact, in 1938, Helen and George produced The Greatest Show on Earth, and she even acted in it.
And then they married. Helen was 58 years old when she first got married.
There's a production of The Man Who Came to Dinner where she played the nurse, and she played opposite her husband, George Soames, and it was apparently a huge hit for the Elitch Theater. Everybody in Denver came to see it because it was not only a wonderful thing to see this married couple on stage sharing barbs with each other and kind of going at each other in this, George S. Kaufman script, but, it was also a really wonderful production, and it really just soared her career as an actress.
She and George in 1947 moved to their wonderful residence in 707 Washington, and also had a place in New York City. And during that time, she met Don Sewell.
Don Sewell worked with her, and they became quite close.
Helen was a chameleon. She was a different thing to everyone she met, but she charmed them all.
She became clearly ensconced with the theater community in New York, and very well respected.
She was a member of the AVANTA, the American National Theater and Academy, and so was Dawn. And she wanted legal assistance on many of her productions, and people said you should get better acquainted with Mr. Sewell because he knows exactly what he's doing in that field. So Don began representing her in various theatrical endeavors. And they had quite a few productions on Broadway. Thurber Carnival was one, for example. She was nominated for a Tony.
So that was a real big feather in the cap of any producer. But here's Helen Bonfils, who comes from Denver, and now she is truly a part of that Broadway community.
There was a competitor who was interested in taking over the Denver Post, and so she called upon her friend, Donald Sewell.
She persuaded Mr. Sewell to leave his law practice in New York and move to Denver to become the head of the Denver Post.
He helped her establish the Helen G. Bonfils Foundation and eventually established an employee stock option so that all of the interests of the Denver Post could be owned by not only Helen, but by the employees of the Denver Post.
At the same time as he was running the Denver Post, Don Sewell was listening to Miss Helen of her dream to bring theater to Colorado.
I put the two together, the theater and the Post, but there's a different type of love. The Post was her child, and she was, I guess the theater was her lover.
Helen had an opportunity to go anywhere that she wanted in the world with the wealth that her family had, and she chose Denver. She saw it as the Wild West and an opportunity to harness her visionary love of theater and invest it in a community that otherwise wouldn't have what we have today.
I think that living in Colorado impacted her in such a positive way because you're not under the microscope of one of the coasts. You're not in New York, you're not in Los Angeles, you're in really God's country. You're in this beautiful, beautiful place.
Helen knew that this community would embrace world-class theater. Nobody else knew it. There were people who said, you'll never get 100 people to come to the theater because this is not what this community is. This is a cow town. And, theater's for New Yorkers. It's not for people in Colorado.
Helen always had a way of doing it the Helen way. She brought relationships from the East Coast and the West Coast to Denver.
You have the space to create, and you have the space to be free. And she had this great opportunity after her father had passed to then suddenly really dig down deep and do what she had a passion for. She would reach out to nurture the arts beyond the theaters that she had worked in or that held her name.
She was making sure that theater was mobile. She was the first one ever putting theater in schools. Before there might have even been a library, there might have been an opportunity for a child to see a play.
She became such a fixture in the Denver theater community that a theater was then named for her, the Helen Bonfils Theater on Colfax Avenue. When other theaters in Denver were looking to cast actors, they would go to New York, they would go to Los Angeles, and they would get the cream of the crop, and people wanted to work here in Denver.
So it was a wonderful time, a great heyday for the Denver community, and she brought a lot of local and national celebrities to Denver. Celebrities as Kevin Kline, Patti LuPone, and even local celebrity Cleo Parker Robinson.
Grace Kelly, Mickey Rooney, Douglas Fairbanks, nationally prominent stars.
They wanted to get out of the cities. They wanted to work in the beautiful western town of Denver, where they knew it was going to be a beautiful summer and they could kind of get a vacation but work at the same time.
And even today, where Tattered Cover is, which is the location of where the Bonfils Memorial Theater was located, the children's section of the bookstore is where the children's theater was. So she saw that it was something that you fell in love with at an early age and should continue on throughout your life.
She supported a variety of endeavors around Denver.
Helen established the Helen G. Bonfils Foundation and established the Bonfils Blood Bank and named it in honor of her mother, established the Bonfils Tumor Clinic in memory of her father, and helped constitute the Nurses' Home at CU School of Medicine. She also supported the University of Denver, Denver Symphony Orchestra, Central City Opera, the Museum of Nature and Science, the Denver Zoo, the Botanic Gardens, Elitch's. All of these are examples of rich assets for the Denver community in the state of Colorado.
Helen was a great supporter of many different philanthropies, and I'm guessing nearly anybody who knocked on her door, if they had a halfway credible story, she would donate.
She supported many of the Catholic churches in the Denver area.
Nuns would call her up and say, oh, the poor little girl here cannot afford her first communion dress. Could you help her? And Helen did a lot of that, I think a lot of it anonymously.
In fact, she built the Church of the Holy Ghost in honor and memory of her parents. She also assisted in the building of other churches.
She loved animals. She was always picking up stray dogs or cats. She gave a lot of money to the various shelters around town.
She invested in the community. She ensured that access for all was paramount in everything that she did, from the health and well-being of the community to the arts and culture. She was really having a profound impact on everything in Denver and the metro region.
After George Soames died, she was just lost. She found herself, as she said, very lonesome, and she married her former chauffeur, Mike Davis. And Mike was half her age. He was 28 or 29. Then they divorced in 1971. She spent pretty much the last 6 or 7 years of her life in St. Joseph's Hospital. She had a very large suite. In fact, it was almost half a floor where she had to live the last part of her life.
Helen passed away in 1972. It wasn't until 1973 that Mr. Sewell took Helen's dream of having a world-class theater community in Denver and began concepting what would eventually become the Denver Center for the Performing Arts.
Don took the fortune that Miss Helen left in the Denver Post and other assets and pushed the dream for the Denver Center for the Performing Arts.
I think something like that was, I'm sure, in the back of her mind as an ultimate goal. But the actual creation of that and the idea about that type of a size of a thing really came after her death.
It was Helen's dream and the implementation of Helen's dream, backed by her fortune, that didn't bring community theater to Denver. It brought world-class theater to this community.
We now really embrace how important arts and culture is to our community.
She left her entire wealth to this organization, and even today, the Bonfils Foundation, which came from Helen's wealth, still provides funding for the DCPA and will continue to provide funding for the DCPA for many, many years to come.
By 1979, what was first a dream became reality.
The Denver Center for the Performing Arts was built, the theaters were built, the complex was built, and today, thanks to Miss Helen and to Don Sewell, we have the largest performing arts center in the United States outside of New York.
I think that Helen's legacy is clear, that she has given us the Denver Center for the Performing Arts.
And thanks to Helen's long-standing commitment to having a rich theater community, the Denver Center now enjoys more than 8 theaters on the complex and has entertained more than 25 million people over the last 40 years.
Mayor Hancock today routinely refers to the Denver Center for the Performing Arts as the crown jewel of the city of Denver.
And she really put Denver on the map. And today we now boast the largest nonprofit theater organization in the country.
Every time anybody in Colorado walks in the doors of the Denver Center for the Performing Arts to see theater, they can thank Helen Bonfils. And it came from an idea, from a tenacity of a young lady who adored her father, who carried on not only his footsteps in the newspaper, but created her own footsteps to put this city on the map worldwide.
Helen should be remembered for how she cared about Denver.
The culture of this community is far, far greater today than it would have been had Helen not determined to make it happen here.
I think it's important that we remember the many contributions that Helen Bonfils made to Denver because she was a pioneer.
Trying to sum up somebody's greatest accomplishment who has so many great accomplishments is difficult.
Her greatest accomplishment was keeping the Denver Post as solid and stable and as productive as it was throughout her entire life.
I think keeping the Post going was probably number one. Number two would have to be the Denver Center for the Performing Arts.
Being an artist myself, I would have to lean towards her work in the arts and her work in creating an exciting and dynamic entertainment scene in Denver.
Her greatest accomplishment was dreaming of bringing world-class theater to Colorado. Without Helen's dream and knowledge, it would have never happened.
I can't even imagine what it would be like not to have the Denver Center for the Performing Arts.
The fact that the Denver Center is still here for us, the Bonfils Theater still exists on Colfax as the tattered cover, and that the Elitch Theater still stands. I think these 3 really amazing artistic ventures that she took part in are a wonderful legacy. And who knows what still the future holds for these institutions.
It's amazing how one leader can really start a revolution, and she started an arts and culture revolution here in Denver.
She not only brought important things to community, but her vision perhaps changed the culture of Denver for generations and generations to come.
I think it's wonderful that a lot of the work that Helen Bonfils did when she was alive is still continuing. that we still see the effects in our daily life as Coloradans. It's amazing, and may we all still have effects of ourselves when we leave this earth that still have a positive impact on the future.
Even those of us who never knew her, we feel like we know her from what she brought to the Denver Post, for her vision for the theater, and most of us who know about her never knew her, but we feel like she was our Miss Helen.